I heard them before I saw them. The creak of the porch boards, the low murmur of radio static, the particular kind of silence that falls when men are trying not to make noise. I had been sitting in my recliner in the dark, couldn't sleep, hadn't been able to sleep properly in weeks, and I heard all of it before the first fist hit the door. They didn't knock. That's the thing people don't understand. They didn't knock like a person knocks. They hit the door like they already owned what was on the other side of it. Police, open up! I was 63 years old. I had bad knees, a bad hip, and a pacemaker that my cardiologist liked to call your little insurance policy. I stood up slowly from that recliner, the way I do everything now, and I walked toward the door with my hands already up. Old habit. You learn certain things and they stay in your body long after you think you've forgotten them. I opened the door before they could hit it again. There were 4 of them, young men mostly. Vests, flashlights, hands near holsters, and behind them, standing just off the porch in the yellow light from the street lamp, was my wife. She was smiling. Not the way you smile when something is funny. The way you smile when something you've been planning for a long time is finally happening exactly the way you imagined it. That's him, she said. That's the man who threatened me. I looked at her. We'd been married for 22 years. I had held her hand when her mother died. I had driven her to every chemotherapy appointment when she had the scare 6 years ago, sat in those waiting rooms with their bad coffee and their old magazines, and held her hand through all of it. 22 years. She didn't look at me. She was looking at the officers the way a person looks when they want to make sure someone is watching them perform. Sir, we need you to step outside. I stepped outside. We have a report of a domestic disturbance. Your wife states that you threatened her with physical harm this evening and that she fears for her safety. That's not true, I said. Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back. I turned around. I placed my hands behind my back. I heard the handcuffs before I felt them, that metallic sound, that particular click. I had heard that sound before, a long time ago, in a context these young men would not have believed if I told them. My wife laughed. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, almost private, like she was laughing at something only she could see. I turned my head just enough to look at her, and she was looking at her phone. One of the officers, young, maybe 28, with a military-style haircut that told me something about where he'd been before the department, took my wallet from my back pocket, standard procedure when you're being taken into custody. He flipped it open to get my ID. I watched his face. I've spent a long time learning to read faces. It was part of the work. You had to know in a fraction of a second whether the person across from you was scared or lying or about to do something you wouldn't be able to stop. I got good at it, good enough that it became automatic the way breathing is automatic. He looked at my ID, then he looked at something else in my wallet, a card laminated that I carried for years without ever needing to use it. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved up to me and then back down to the card. He turned slightly so that his body was angled away from the other officers, away from my wife. He looked at the card one more time. Then he straightened up, came to attention the way you only do if it's been drilled into you somewhere. And he looked me in the eye and gave me a slow, deliberate salute. Nobody spoke. My wife looked up from her phone. The other officers looked at their colleague. Nobody seemed to know what to do with what they were seeing. Sergeant, I said quietly, as you were. His name was Kowalski. I know that now. He told me later that he had done 2 tours before he came home and joined the department. He told me that when he saw that card, his first thought was that it had to be a mistake. His second thought was that if it wasn't a mistake, he was standing in the middle of something he did not fully understand. He was right about that. I want to tell you who I am, or rather, who I was, before I became the man standing on his own porch in handcuffs at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in October. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. My father worked at a GM plant, and my mother worked at the elementary school as an aide. We were not rich. We were comfortable in the way that working people were comfortable in those years. Enough food, a decent house, a car that ran most of the time. I was an average student. I played baseball in the summers and read too much in the winters and had no particular plan for my life until I was 17 years old, and a recruiter came to our school and said things that made sense to me in a way that nothing else had. I enlisted in the Navy. That was 1979. I was 17 and a half years old, and I thought I knew what I was walking into. I didn't know anything. What I became over the next 31 years is something I'm not able to fully describe, not because I don't want to, but because most of it is still classified in ways that would require more paperwork than either of us has time for. What I can tell you is that I was not a desk officer. I was not a cook. I was not a man who spent his career on a carrier, watching the ocean and waiting to come home. I went to places that don't show up on the briefings with men whose names I still can't say out loud in certain company, and I did things that were necessary and difficult, and that I have made a certain peace with over the years. I was medically retired at 51 after an operation in a country I still can't name, left me with a knee that would never be right again, and 3 other injuries that my medical file describes in language designed to be unreadable by anyone without the right clearance. My official record listed me as a logistics coordinator. That's what it said, logistics coordinator. I came home. I bought a house in a small town in Virginia, close enough to the mountains that I could breathe, far enough from everything else that I could be quiet. I spent 2 years mostly alone, which was what I needed. And then I met my wife at a church potluck dinner, which is the kind of sentence I still find funny when I say it out loud. After everything, a church potluck dinner. She was charming and smart, and she laughed easily, and I was lonely in the way that men like me get lonely. Not for people exactly, but for the idea of ordinary life, for something that looked like what I had seen other people have. I thought she was offering that. I did not understand for a long time what she was actually offering. The first signs were small. They always are. She didn't like my friends. Not that I had many, but the few I stayed in contact with from the old life. The men who would call on certain anniversaries or show up unannounced in the way the people do when they have been through things together. She found reasons to be cool with them, reasons why it was inconvenient when it came. She asked questions about them that felt less like curiosity and more like cataloging. She spent money in ways I didn't fully track. I was not a man who would pay close attention to money in the way civilians do. I had been on government salary most of my life. My needs had been simple, and I had savings I never touched. She touched them, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, in the way water works its stone. She told stories about me to people we knew, small stories. He has such a bad temper. He doesn't communicate well. You know how men who've been in the military are. The stories were not true, but they were not provably untrue either. And I noticed too late that she was building something with them. An architecture of grievance, a version of me that she was constructing, brick by brick, for an audience I hadn't known she was gathering. And then there was the man at her office. I will call him her colleague because that is the most neutral word available. She worked as an office manager for a real estate group, and her colleague was one of the agents. He was 15 years younger than her, and he drove a car that cost more than made sense on an agent's commission. And she talked about him the way people talk about people they're trying not to talk about too much. I confronted her once, calmly. I asked her directly, the way I had been trained to ask questions when I needed honest answers. She cried. She told me I was paranoid. She told me that my time in the service had left me unable to trust anyone, unable to feel safe, unable to maintain a normal relationship. She used clinical language, attachment issues, hypervigilance, emotional unavailability, and she delivered it with such fluency that for a moment I wondered if she was right. I know now that she had been talking to a lawyer for 4 months at that point. She had been documenting, photographing, recording, building the case while I sat across from her and tried to figure out what was wrong with me. The night they put me in handcuffs, she had called 911 at 11:14 p.m. and reported that I had threatened to hurt her. The call log, which I obtained later, showed that the call lasted 6 minutes. She was specific. She used terms she had clearly been coached to use. She mentioned fear. She mentioned her history of concerning behavior. She mentioned twice that she was afraid of what I might do. I'd been sitting in my recliner watching a documentary about migratory birds. They took me to the station in the back of a patrol car. I didn't speak during the ride. There was nothing to say that would help. I understood the situation clearly, not because it had happened to me before, but because I'd been on the other side of situations like this one, and I knew that what mattered was not what was true, but what could be demonstrated to be true, and that the person who looked like the victim in the first 5 minutes usually had an advantage that was difficult to overcome. I needed to be patient. I needed to be calm. I needed to not say or do anything that would give them what they were looking for. They put me in a room with a table and 2 chairs and a mirror that wasn't fooling anyone. I sat down. I waited. I have waited in worse places for longer. Kowalski came in first, alone, about 20 minutes after they booked me. He set my wallet on the table between us and looked at me for a moment without speaking. "I owe you an explanation," I said. "No, sir," he said. "I don't think you owe me anything." He had looked at the card. I could tell by the way he was sitting, that particular stillness that comes over people when they've learned something that rearranges the room. He had looked it up, and whatever he'd been able to access had been enough to tell him that the man sitting across from him was not who his wife had described on that 911 call. "My record," I said, "is going to require some phone calls." "Yes, sir," he said. "I figured. You won't be able to make those calls yourself. You'll need to go up the chain, probably more than once." He nodded slowly. "I didn't threaten her," I said. "I want that on the record in whatever way it can be on the record. I was watching television." "Yes, sir." He paused. "Captain." "I haven't been a captain in 12 years, I said. "You can call me by my name." But he didn't. None of them did after that. Not the detective who came in an hour later looking like he'd been woken up from a deep sleep and wasn't sure yet what he was dealing with. Not the department supervisor who arrived 40 minutes after that, straightening his tie in the hallway before he came through the door. And certainly not the man who showed up at 2:47 in the morning in a dark suit and a government ID that he did not show to anyone except the department supervisor, who looked at it and immediately left the room. The man in the suit sat down across from me. He was maybe 45, compact. The kind of person who had learned to look unremarkable and had worked at it long enough that it was now effortless. "You should have called us," he said. "I didn't want to involve the office," I said. "The office is involved now." "I know." He opened a folder and pushed a single piece of paper across the table. I didn't look at it. "She's been talking to a journalist," he said. That was the first thing that actually surprised me that night. "She doesn't know anything," I said. "She knows more than she should. Her lawyer has been asking questions to the wrong people, and one of the wrong people talk more than they should have. Not operationally sensitive, but..." He paused. "It's a complication." "Then it's a complication you'll handle," I said. "I just want my life back." He looked at me for a moment. "We'll make some calls in the morning. You should be out of here before noon." I was out before 10. My wife had not expected me home that quickly. I could tell by the look on her face when I pulled into the driveway. She was standing at the kitchen window, and the expression that crossed her face when she saw my truck was not the expression of a woman who was relieved that her husband was safe. It was the expression of someone whose plan had encountered an obstacle. Her lawyer called her within the hour. I don't know what he said, but I can guess, because by that afternoon, she had stopped returning his calls too. What I found out over the following weeks was worse than I had imagined, and I had imagined quite a lot. She had been in contact with her colleague for 14 months. She had moved money. Not a little money, but a significant portion of what I had saved over 31 years of service into an account I hadn't known existed, opened in a name that was technically hers but structured in a way that suggested legal advice. She had signed documents. She had made arrangements. She had also, and this is the part that still sits cold in my chest when I think about it, told my daughter things about me. My daughter from my first marriage. She was 31, lived in Colorado, worked as a nurse. My wife had been calling her regularly for months, feeding her a version of me that was designed to make her afraid of me, to make her pull away, to make her unavailable as an ally. My daughter called me herself 2 weeks after that night because she had heard from someone in my old network that something had happened. She called me and she was crying before she even said hello because she had started to believe some of what she'd been told. And now she was on the phone with me and she could hear that it wasn't true. Daddy, she said. She still calls me that, as since she was 4 years old. Daddy, I'm so sorry. I should have called you. I should have asked you directly. You called me now, I said. She told me you'd gotten violence. She told me the neighbors had heard things. Honey, you know me. She was quiet for a moment. I do know you. That's why I didn't feel right. But she stopped. She was so convincing. I know, I said. She's good at it. My daughter flew out 3 weeks later. She sat in my kitchen and went through everything with me. The financial records, the phone records, the documentation I had been quietly building since the morning I got home from the police station. She's a nurse, not a lawyer, but she's organized and she's thorough, and she was furious in the focused, quiet way that is so much more useful than the loud kind. You need a lawyer, she said. I have one, a good one. Also that the divorce proceedings took 11 months. I won't walk you through every detail because some of it is still under seal and some of it is simply too tedious to be worth your time. What I will tell you is that her lawyer, who had, in fact, been approaching journalists and asking questions he had no business asking, resigned from the case in month 4 after receiving a visit from 2 men who identified themselves only as federal employees and who left no card and signed no log. Her colleague, the one with the expensive car, was quietly terminated from his real estate firm after an audit that nobody officially connected to me revealed certain irregularities in his commission reporting that amounted to something the IRS found very interesting. And my wife, after 11 months and a financial reckoning that undid most of what she had built over those careful, patient months of planning, was left with the house she'd grown up with in her family before we married, a settlement that her lawyer called inadequate, and that my lawyer called generous, and the knowledge that the story she'd planned to tell had been made unavailable to the one journalist she'd been cultivating. I got my savings back, not all of it. Some of it had moved in ways that were difficult to trace, and there were legal costs, and I had been advised in clear terms not to pursue certain avenues of recovery, but most of it, enough. I got my reputation back. Among the people who matter, and they are a small and specific group, the people who matter to me. There was never a question about who I was. But among the neighbors, among the people at the church where Reed attended together, among the handful of acquaintances who had heard her version of events before mine, that took longer. It took my daughter flying out and having coffee with people. It took my old friend who had served alongside me for 16 years showing up in that town in Virginia and simply being present, being the person he is, and letting people draw their own conclusions about the kind of men I'd spent my life with. It took time. Everything worth having takes time. My daughter is coming out again next month. She's bringing her kids, my grandchildren, a girl of 9 and a boy of 6, who call me Pop Pop, and who think, based on the small amount I have shared with them in age-appropriate terms, that I am some kind of retired superhero. I don't correct them. There are worse things a man could be remembered as. I sit on the porch in the evenings now, which is something I didn't used to do. I used to prefer to be inside where I could see all the exits and account for the light. That's the kind of thing the service puts in you and it takes years to locate the off switch. But lately I've been sitting outside, in the particular kind of quiet that comes to small Virginia towns after the commuters have gone to bed and before the birds start up. I think about that night sometimes, the handcuffs, the sound my wife made, that quiet private laugh, the look on Kowalski's face when he understood what he was looking at. I ran into him once, about 6 months after everything. He was off duty, in line at a hardware store. He recognized me first. He looked like he wasn't sure whether to say anything, so I helped him out. Kowalski, I said, how are you? Good, sir. He paused. You doing all right? Better, I said. Getting there. He nodded. He seemed like he wanted to say something more, and then thought better of it, and then decided to say it anyway. I want you to know, he said, I've never done that before. What I did that night, that's not something I do. I know, I said. I just felt like he stopped, started again. It felt like the right thing. I looked at him for a moment. 28, maybe 29. 2 tours in places where young men learn what the right thing is and how much it costs. It was, I said, it was the right thing. She wanted to break me. She spent 2 years building the architecture for it. The stories, the documents, the cultivated sympathy, the emergency call in the middle of the night. She was thorough and she was patient and she was, in her way, formidable. But you didn't know who she was dealing with. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. I have been shot at in 4 countries. I have made decisions in the dark that I will carry for the rest of my life. I have watched men I loved not come home from places that don't appear in any official record. I have survived worse than a woman with a grudge and a good lawyer. The truth found its way to the surface the way it does, eventually, when the people carrying it refuse to let it sink. That's all I ever trusted. The truth and the patience to wait for it. That was enough? There's something I keep coming back to, and it's not the handcuffs or the police lights or even the look on my wife's face that night. It's the recliner. The fact that I was sitting in a recliner watching a documentary about birds when my life came apart. There's something almost funny about that, in the way certain true things are funny. Not ha-ha funny, but the kind that makes you go quiet for a second. I spent 31 years making decisions in the dark. Real darkness, the kind that doesn't have a comfortable chair in it. And then I came home, tried to build something ordinary. And the most dangerous situation I ever found myself in was inside my own house with a woman I had loved, who had spent 2 years building a case against me while I sat 10 feet away. What she didn't account for, what people like her never account for, is that character has a way of showing itself exactly when the pressure is highest. Not the character you perform in public, not the version of yourself you curate for an audience, the real one, the one that was built by every hard choice you made when nobody was watching. Kowalski didn't salute me because of a title. He saluted me because of what a piece of laminated paper told him about 31 years of decisions. He was reading a record that my wife never knew existed, a record of a life she had never thought to ask about, because she was too busy constructing a version of me that fit what she needed me to be. That's what dishonesty ultimately costs. Not the short term. In the short term, dishonesty often works. It worked for her for a while. She had a plan, and she executed it with patience and real intelligence. I'll give her that. But the foundation of the whole structure was a lie about who I was, and when that lie met the truth, the structure didn't hold. It couldn't. A lie about a man's character is only as durable as the man's actual character is weak. Mine wasn't. My daughter flew out to sit at my kitchen table and go through financial records with me. She didn't have to do that. She's a nurse with 2 kids and a life of her own, and she drove to the airport on a Tuesday and got on a plane because she knew me well enough to know that something was wrong with the story she'd been told, that took something from her. Not just time, but the willingness to question what she'd been fed, to stay curious when it would have been easier to just believe it. That's a kind of courage that doesn't get talked about enough, the courage to keep asking. What I know now, sitting on my porch in the evenings watching the light change over the mountains, is that the life I built before the marriage, the discipline, the choices, the 31 years of doing the hard thing because it was right and not because it was easy. That life protected me, not in the way armor protects you, more like the way roots hold a tree. You don't see them, they don't make noise, but when the storm comes, they're the only thing that matters. She wanted to break me. What she found instead was that there was nothing left to break.